serving only to fill up the gaps in the critical system of speculative reason, for this is for its own purpose complete, or like the props and buttresses which in a hastily constructed building are often added afterwards, but as true members which make the connection of the system plain, and show us concepts, here presented as real, which there could only be presented problematically. This remark applies especially to the concept of freedom, respecting which one cannot but observe with surprise that so many boast of being able to understand it quite well, and to explain its possibility, while they regard it only psychologically, whereas, if they had studied it in a transcendental point of view, they must have recognized that it is not only indispensable as a problematical concept in the complete use of speculative reason, but also quite incomprehensible, and that if they afterwards came to consider its practical use, they must needs have come to the very mode of determining the principle of this, to which they are now so loth to assent. The concept of freedom is the stone of stumbling for all empiricists, but at the same time the key to the loftiest practical principles for critical moralists, who perceive by its means that they must necessarily proceed by a rational method. For this reason I beg the reader not to pass lightly over what is said of this concept at the end of the Analytic. I must leave it to those who are acquainted with works of this kind to judge whether such a system as that of the practical reason, which here is developed from the critical examination of it, has cost much or little trouble, especially in seeking not to miss the true point of view from which the whole can be rightly sketched. It presupposes, indeed, the fundamental principles of the metaphysic of morals, but only in so far as this gives a preliminary acquaintance with the principle of duty, and assigns and justifies a definite formula thereof. In other respects it is independent. It results from the nature of this practical faculty itself that the complete classification of all practical sciences cannot be added, as in the critique of the speculative reason. For it is not possible to define duties specially, as human duties, with a view to their classification, until the subject of this definition, viz., man, is known according to his actual nature, at least so far as is necessary with respect to duty. This, however, does not belong to a critical examination of the practical reason, the business of which is only to assign, in a complete manner, the principles of its possibility, extent, and limits, without special reference to human nature. The classification then belongs to the system of science, not to the system of criticism. In the second part of the Analytic I have given, as I trust, a sufficient answer to the objection of a truth-loving and acute critic of the fundamental principles of the metaphysic of morals, a critic always worthy of respect to the objection, namely, that the notion of good was not established before the moral principle, as he thinks it ought to have been. I have also had regard to many of the objections which have reached me from men who show that they have at heart the discovery of the truth, and I shall continue to do so, for those who have only their old system before their eyes, and who have already settled what is to be approved or disapproved, do not desire any explanation which might stand in the way of their own private opinion. I have no fear, as regards this treatise, of the reproach that I wish to introduce a new language, since the sort of knowledge here in question has itself somewhat of an everyday character. Nor, even in the case of the former critique, could this reproach occur to anyone who had thought it through, and not merely turned over the leaves. To invent new words, where language has no lack of expressions for given notions, is a childish effort to distinguish oneself from the crowd, if not by new and true thoughts, yet by new patches on the old garment. If, therefore, the readers of that work know any more familiar expressions which are as suitable to the thought as those seem to me to be, or if they think they can show the futility of these thoughts themselves, and hence that of the expression, they would in the first case very much oblige me, for I only desire to be understood; and in the second case they would deserve well of philosophy. But as long as these thoughts stand, I very much doubt that suitable and yet more common expressions for them can be found. In this manner, then, the a priori principles of two faculties of the mind, the faculty of cognition and that of desire, would be found and determined as to the conditions, extent, and limits of their use, and thus a sure foundation be paid for a scientific system of philosophy, both theoretic and practical. Nothing worse could happen to these labors than that anyone should make the unexpected discovery that there neither is, nor can be, any a priori knowledge at all. But there is no danger of this. This would be the same thing as if one sought to prove by reason that there is no reason. For we only say that we know something by reason, when we are conscious that we could have known it, even if it had not been given to us in experience. Hence, rational knowledge and knowledge a priori are one and the same. It is a clear contradiction to try to extract necessity from a principle of experience, ex pomise aquam, and to try by this to give a judgment true universality, without which there is no rational inference, not even inference from analogy, which is at least a presumed universality and objective necessity. To substitute subjective necessity, that is, custom, for objective, which exists only in a priori judgments, is to deny to reason the power of judging about the object, i.e. of knowing it, and what belongs to it. It implies, for example, that we must not say of something which often or always follows a certain antecedent state, that we can conclude from this to that, for this would imply objective necessity and the notion of an a priori connection, but only that we may expect similar cases just as animals do, that is, that we reject the notion of cause altogether as false and a mere delusion. As to attempting to remedy this want of objective and consequently universal validity by saying that we can see no ground for attributing any other sort of knowledge to other rational beings, if this reasoning were valid, our ignorance would do more for the enlargement of our knowledge than all our meditation. For then, on this very ground that we have no knowledge of any other rational beings besides man, we should have a right to suppose them to be of the same nature as we know ourselves to be; that is, we should really know them. I omit to mention that universal assent does not prove the objective validity of a judgment, i.e., its validity as a cognition, and although this universal assent should accidentally happen, it could furnish no proof of agreement with the object. On the contrary, it is the objective validity which alone constitutes the basis of a necessary universal consent. Hume would be quite satisfied with this system of universal empiricism, for, as is well known, he desired nothing more than that, instead of inscribing any objective meaning to the necessity in the concept of a cause, a merely subjective one should be assumed, viz., custom, in order to deny that reason could judge about God, freedom, and immortality; and if once his principles were granted, he was certainly well able to deduce his conclusions therefrom with all logical coherence. But even Hume did not make his empiricism so universal as to include mathematics. He holds the principles of mathematics to be analytical, and if his were correct, they would certainly be apodeictic also. But we would not infer from this that the reason has the faculty of forming apodeictic judgments in philosophy also, that is to say, those which are synthetical judgments, like the judgment of causality. But if we adopt a universal empiricism, then mathematics will be included. Now, if this science is in contradiction with a reason that admits only empirical principles, as it inevitably is in the antinomy in which mathematics prove the infinite divisibility of space, which empiricism cannot admit, then the greatest possible evidence of demonstration is in manifest contradiction with the alleged conclusions from experience, and we are driven to ask, like Chalcedon's blind patient, which deceives me, sight or touch? For empiricism is based on a necessity felt, rationalism on a necessity seen. And thus universal empiricism reveals itself as absolute skepticism. It is erroneous to attribute this in such an unqualified sense to Hume, since he left at least one certain touchstone, which can only be found in a priori principles, although experience consists not only of feelings, but also of judgments. However, as in this philosophical and critical age such empiricism can scarcely be serious, and it is probably put forward only as an intellectual exercise, and for the purpose of putting in a clearer light, by contrast, the necessity of rational a priori principles, we can only be grateful to those who employ themselves in this otherwise uninstructive labor. End of Preface.